Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, fan of lots of things, creative writing teacher, various other stuff as well. And this is the second in a series of videos that I'm making about writing craft, in which I field questions from writers and readers about my own work and about my advice, such as it is, to other writers. And there were a number of questions that came in last week, which all could be grouped together in terms of a single issue. And the broad question is about to what extent I recommend outlining a story before you write it. And when I say story, I'm talking about novels. I'm generally not a short fiction guy. And the question of plotting as opposed to pantsing, i.e. writing by the seat of your pants, making it up as you go along, is generally applicable more to long fiction than short. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So let me start with the questions, and these are all different but related. Savannah asks, what do you do to combat writer's block? Now, that is a separate question in certain respects, and I'm going to come back to it in my next video. But one of the ways that I combat writer's block is by working out a story in advance. So that's why I'm grouping it together with these other questions about planning things in advance. Kyle asks, how do you track the progress of plot lines and parallel action in the planning and execution phases of your writing? That's a complicated, more specific question, which hopefully I'm going to get to as well. Joe asks simply, plotter or pantser? Again, pantser means somebody who writes by the seat of their pants, as opposed to planning it out in advance. And why? And then a more detailed question on the same subject from Len, who says he's a third of the way through his outline and he's already at 6,000 words. He's looking at the potential for his outline to be 20,000 words, and he's concerned that that is going to be too long to be usable, that he's going too deep. So he's asking, how deep should a writer go in the first outline for a story? Should it contain most of the characters, potential plot twists, or should it just be a basic outline of an idea and flesh it out from there? So let me start by saying the same thing that I said last time, which is that obviously what I'm advising is what works for me. Different things work for different people. The question always is to make sure that what you like actually works for you. I've worked with many young writers who don't want to outline, don't want to plan things in advance. They just want to dive in and write. And they say, this is what works for me, this is what I like to do. But I'll be honest with you, frequently it doesn't work for them. When they write without an outline, the writing it lacks direction. When you look at a long project that has been developed over a long period of time, the story wanders. It shifts in terms of its genre. It shifts in terms of character dynamics and what's going on, because the person who's writing it doesn't have a clear sense of where the macro story is going, or even what the macro story is. So again, the issue always is sometimes what is better for your writing is not necessarily what you are most comfortable with initially. And I'll be honest with you, even though I am mostly a plotter, and I'll clarify what I mean by that in a second, it's not something I particularly enjoy. It's work. I much prefer the sentence level stuff. I much prefer diving into a scene, creating characters, working with fun things and twists and tweaks of the story. I much prefer that. But I have found that if I don't outline things in advance, those diving into the story will often lead me in weird directions, and I will lose track of where I am, or I'll paint myself into a corner. I'll get stuck where suddenly I've thrown some stuff at myself and I don't know how to get it out. And that speaks to Savannah's question about writer's block. If by writer's block you mean what is the next book going to be, that's a separate issue. But if you mean how do I get from this scene to the next scene, that's a problem that you encounter when you don't plan things out. Now, let me say, famously, there are writers like Stephen King who go on record a lot who say, I don't outline, I don't plot stuff out. I just dive into the story, I have a premise, I have characters, and then I develop them. So, I'm not saying that failure to outline your story doesn't work. There are plenty of writers out there for whom it does work. But I will also say, most of us are not Stephen King. Most of us don't have a profound sense of story like built into our brains at some sort of genetic level, either through habit or talent or whatever, so that you can work and have a sense of where things are going all the time. I will also say that even though I'm a huge Stephen King fan, I sometimes feel that the stories struggle in the final third, that the endings are the least satisfying part of the resolution. And sometimes, for me, as a reader and writer, I wonder if the endings would be more satisfying if they had been conceived from the start as an integral part of the journey, which is the story. Again, Stephen King is a far more successful writer than me, so I'm not giving him notes. And I would also say that his book on writing is one of the best things out there for craft, and I would strongly recommend it, and I've used it in classes many times. If you are going to write by the seat of your pants, if you are just going to make it up as you go because you don't want to outline, because that's boring and not a lot of fun, fine. But then you need to be a really good and really rigorous editor, self-editor. And that's not a lot of fun either, because it requires the same sort of detailed emphasis. And I would say that I find that much harder, partly because I'm very close to the story by the time I finished it. And so to go back over it and say, this entire section here doesn't work, and it needs to go or be radically modified, that feels like much more work than making up some kind of outline at the beginning. And, the problem with a novel, and again, it's not like a movie script where you can move a few things around, change a few words here and there, and radically restructure the story. Novels don't work like that. If you have to go back in and change elements of plot and character early in the novel, say, that's going to have ripples that go all the way through the story. You're then going to have to go back and make sure that that tracks all the way through. Otherwise, when people are reading it, it's going to feel like you've forgotten about things, that something a character has just done should be uppermost on their minds, but they don't seem to be thinking about it at all. All of this, I think, is mostly fixable by having some kind of outline, some sort of blueprint for the whole. So let me talk a little about what works for me. As I say, I don't always use the same method. The novel that I'm working on right now, the second in the Hideki Smith series, I had really strong ideas about the premise of the story, where it was going to pick up in relation to the previous story, and of course a lot of the characters and the world are already established because I know what they are. So it feels a lot easier to then launch into a second story. But I didn't plan it rigorously, and I found when I got about halfway through that the premise that I had in mind only got me so far, and I then needed to figure out what actually happened and how things were going to wrap up, and I couldn't answer those questions, and it really put the brakes on. And suddenly, instead of using the time that I had carefully set aside to be writing, I was staring at a blank screen or going for long walks while I tried to figure out what happened next. And again, this comes to the writer's block question. I had a kind of writer's block because I didn't know where the story was going. I didn't know what was going to happen. So I then had to force myself to go back to the beginning and say, okay, I'm going to create an outline sort of retroactively, put in all the stuff I already know, and then figure out how things are going to expand and conclude. So for me, for a standard length novel, an outline is going to look like 10, 15 pages, almost like a short story. So 10 to 15 pages, that's what? 3,000 words, something along that kind of, it doesn't matter, right? And this speaks to Len's question, because ultimately it doesn't matter how long your outline is. Again, it's whatever works for you. I don't think it's possible to have an outline that has too much detail in it, And it might make the writing of the novel itself much easier. You know, the Jeffrey Deaver, who's a thriller writer, famously writes an outline which is almost half the length of the novel. I couldn't do that. But there's a reason that he does it. And the reason is that he's a mystery writer. He writes crime thrillers that are very forensic evidence driven. And you can't wing that stuff. You can't make it up as you go along. It has to be very carefully laid out. Because the plot is incredibly complicated. And it's kind of like building a clock. And the clock works from lots of very small pieces, cogs and gears and wheels that have to fit together precisely in order for the thing to function. There's nothing worse than a mystery or thriller where halfway through you're reading it and you're like, wait a minute, what? This doesn't add up. We should have found this out earlier. This doesn't make sense, and the story unravels and the reader is immediately knocked out of the story. So you can't do that. So I think that it's not an accident that a lot of the more intricate plots are worked out in advance in terms of the way that certain kinds of writer function. Now, as I say, I don't need an outline remotely that long. But coming to Len's question, it is going to have all the major characters in it. It's going to have all the major plot points. It's going to be very event driven, right? Because one of the things, and this is because I know my own writing, I'm quite comfortable writing character interactions and dialogue. I love doing it, which is dangerous, right? Because sometimes I sit down at the computer and think, great, I'm going to write. And I'm in this scene and I've got these characters talking to each other and I'm just having fun with it. And before I know it, I've done 2,500 words. But the scene doesn't do anything. It's just people talking to each other. And it's not advancing the plot. It's not really teaching us anything new. And I'm just entertaining myself. That's not good. And when I write those kind of scenes, I know that maybe I've extended my word count, but I'm going to have to cut most of that. I'm going to have to bin it, or at least put it in a separate document to use at some other time, which I probably won't, but it's a way of making it bearable to cut stuff, right? You put it in a separate file and say, I'll use that some other day. But that's what I mean about being a brutal editor. So if I sit down and I know exactly what has to happen in this scene, I know where it takes place, I know what's going on here, and I know what has to emerge from it and how it connects to the next scene, then it's going to be a much more efficient thing to produce, and it's going to be tighter, and it's going to have a clearer sense of function. So I'm not going to have to do a lot of cutting later on. So as I say, 10 to 15 pages. So it has all the broad developments. Not going to have everything. And I don't want it to have everything, because if I was to do that, 200-page outline for a 400-page novel kind of thing, then all the meat of the story has already been discovered, and the writing process itself doesn't generate anything organically. And I want that. So for me, I want that balance between enough of a blueprint, enough of a map, so that I know where the story is going and how it gets there, pretty much. But I also want enough flexibility that I can find new things along the way, and it will allow those characters to get a little richer and develop more. Now, I will say that if I'm using an outline, and for whatever reason as I'm writing, I start to deviate from the outline, I will go back to the outline and change it. Now, not everybody does this, but for me, that's kind of an essential thing because, again, I don't want to get stuck. I don't want to find myself now writing a new book that is deviating from the outline to such an extent that I run into a problem and I don't know how to fix it, right? So I'm going to go back, I'm going to trim, I'm going to adjust the outline to fit what I'm doing and make sure that the rest of the story still works. And if it doesn't, then I will make changes to the outline. Why? Because it's so much easier to change a 10, 15-page document than it is to change a 400-page novel, right? Where you've already committed to all kinds of stuff and it's late and you spent ages on it. I can write an outline of a story in a week. It might not all be there yet, right? And maybe I need more time to think about it. But in terms of generating 10 pages, yeah, I can do that. and have the shape of what I think the story is going to be. So part of the reasons that I prefer to do some kind of outline for all my work is because I can make sure it makes sense before I've invested a ton of energy and a ton of time. I should be able to tell that a story works. Now, the other thing I would say, one of the reasons that a lot of writers work from outlines is that sometimes they're essential. And by essential, I mean they're required by your publisher. Now, if you're self-publishing, this is a non-issue. It may be a non-issue for most people with small presses. But if you sell a book to a publisher, particularly if you sell the second or third book in a series to a publisher, they will often want to sign off on the overall arc, right? So, for example, with my Steeplejack books, I wrote the first book and I submitted it. And when the publisher accepted it, Tor accepted it, they said, okay, yes, we see this novel is pretty much ready. Obviously, we're going to do some editing, but, it's in good shape. But we also see, as you suggest, in your cover letter, you suggest that this could be a series. And we're interested in the idea of it being a series, so we'd like to know where this goes in book 2 and in book 3. They want to be able to see where it's going. And before you turn in, they don't want, to wait a year and then you send in a complete manuscript and they take one look at it and say, whoa, no, this is not where we thought this was going to go at all. They want a general sense of where things are going. So one of the reasons a lot of people are used to, a lot of professional writers who work with big publishers are used to working with outlines, is that they're often essential. Sometimes you can sell a book based on an outline and a few sample pages. You can certainly use that to get an agent, perhaps. Now, these days, because the market is so much tighter, even authors who were used to selling books based on a pitch or a brief outline are now having to write most or all of the books. So, maybe it doesn't matter, but I think it's a useful, for me, it's now a habit. I didn't used to do it. But, I said in the last video, it took me a long time to get published, and I'm convinced that one of the reasons it took me a long time is because I took a long time over books, and when I was writing them, I wasn't outlining them, and as a result, they didn't always know where they were going, and they tended to meander. When you read the short stories written by little kids, one of the things you notice all the time is that they're almost never unified. They're never coherent, because they're being driven by whatever comes into the mind of the person writing it. The kid, he's like, and then to ride out on their horses into the desert, and there's a velociraptor appears, and they fight the velociraptor, and then a spaceship arrives. That's how kids' minds work. New things coming at them, and they immediately go into the story. This is one of the reasons so many children's stories end with, and then they woke up, and it was all a dream, because then I don't have to unravel the ridiculous plot that I just created for myself. But I think adults do versions of this all the time. We get caught up in a new idea, and suddenly the story starts to go off the rails. So, the advantage of having some kind of outline is that you avoid that core problem. You know where your story is, you know what's going on in it, you know what kind of a story it is, and you know where it's going to finish. As I say, you don't necessarily know everything about it. You don't know how all the stuff is going to resolve. And sometimes when I'm writing and I will find myself thinking, I know something has to happen here. The thing that has to happen is this character makes this discovery. But I don't know how that's going to happen in an interesting way. So I'm going to skip right over that and write the next bit. And eventually I will come back and I'll plug that hole when I know what it is. And then I'll have to make other adjustments, along the way as well. I would say I write generally in a pretty linear fashion. I start from the beginning and I work my way through to the end. I will jump around a little bit, but I tend to write in sequence. Occasionally I'll say, I know I want to write. If a scene is self-contained, then I might be able to write that in isolation. In the Hideki Smith books, most of the story is told from the perspective of the main character, Caleb, also known as Hideki. But there are moments dotted throughout the story, which are told from somebody else's perspective. Incidents, episodes, featuring characters who may only appear in that scene. Those are fun to write, and I can write those in isolation. Because so long as, when I fit them in, so long as the main plot accommodates them, it's okay. If I was to write the main plot in that kind of isolation, it would be very, very difficult, again, to then make it consistent in terms of characters should be thinking about this thing that just happened. But in this scene that I have just inserted in, there's no reference to that. So it feels weird, right? He should have a certain concern. Somebody has just died or whatever. And now I'm not thinking, and now the character is not aware of that or not thinking about it and completely preoccupied with something else, and it doesn't feel right. So I prefer to write pretty much in sequence. But again, this is where the outline is really, really helpful. I try to think of the right metaphor in blueprints and maps, or railroad tracks is too linear because I will deviate, but a map of some sort, knowing how I'm going to get to a certain place. Now, I might vary my route. For me, it's kind of essential, and I recommend it, not because it's the only way to write a book, but because I've read a lot of books from young writers where they clearly didn't have an outline. They didn't have a clear sense of what was going on, and you can tell. You can tell when you read it. Suddenly, there's a character who's super important who was not really there at all in the early part of the book. Suddenly, the book has turned into more of a horror story than it was at the beginning. Sometimes the plots don't make sense, and sometimes they just meander, right? Writers like me who fall in love with those character voices and dialogues and snappy exchanges that go on for pages and pages and pages and nothing is happening. And it's because the author doesn't have a clear sense of the thrust of the story at that point. In terms of the lens question about when is an outline too long, and as I said, I don't think there's such a thing. Unless working on the outline has become a way of dodging writing the book. And I've seen that too. People who plan and plan and plan. It's like people who do research or world building. You know, if they're writing a fantasy novel and they start creating an encyclopedia of the rules of their magic system or whatever it is, or they insist on making maps of the world in which the story takes place. And that's fun as a sideline, but frequently it can become an end in itself. And again, how do we measure success? We measure success by, do you have a complete quality product? And if you have a whole bunch of research or a very extensive outline and no book, then that's not successful. I don't think, as I say, I don't think a very detailed outline is in and of itself a problem, because you've got, hopefully, lots of great stuff to draw on, but it shouldn't become the be-all and end-all of your focus. And, you know, I think you should always be thinking in terms of, how does my outline translate into a full novel? If my outline is only 15 pages, I said, well, that's 3,000 words, then each page of the outline is representing, if my novel is going to be, I don't know, 90,000 words, say, then each page of my 3,000 word outline is representing, what, 30 pages? If I'm shooting to write a 400-page novel, say, and my outline is 15 pages, then each page of my outline has to represent almost 27 pages of actual text. Now, think about that, because a lot can happen, a lot should happen in 27 pages of a novel. That's a lot of text. And one of the things, and this is one of the dangers, I think, of writing a very detailed outline, is that sometimes people say it's an outline, but in fact it's not. It's almost actual text, novel text. So they're writing pages and pages and pages, but they're not getting a lot of story down. This speaks to Kyle's question about how you balancing action and plot within your outline. And for me, the kind of novels that I write are going to have a tonal variety. There are going to be scenes that are dramatic, fueled by action or suspense. There are scenes that are going to be quiet and reflective and thoughtful. There are going to be scenes that are very emotional, scenes that are character-centered, scenes that are plot-centered, and so on. And they need to be mixed. And generally speaking, they need to have a sense of forward movement. And often that means you got a bit more leeway at the beginning to develop a story, to take your time to introduce characters, to establish the backstory, and so on. But certainly as you progress, everything is going to escalate. You don't want to be, if you're reading a story and you're 2/3 of the way through and you find yourself getting bored, that's a problem. At that point in the story, you should be rushing. You want to know what happens. You want to know how things resolve. So often, if you've got like an action component in your story, that action component is going to escalate as you get closer to the end of the book. When I was doing the Secret Machines books with Tom DeLonge, and we were outlining this, and these are big books, 650 pages, whatever. And there's a lot going on, a lot of main character voices, a lot of plot, and building the architecture of the story, because there was so much and different periods and different locations. It was all over the place. But I still wanted the story to feel really coherent. So that outlining stage was really important because I wanted to weave together these different parallel narratives. And part of the idea for that first book was that I wanted all the stories, in a sense, to come to the same point. I wanted to somehow get all those characters into the same space at the end of the story, and I wanted it to feel increasingly breathless, right? And so I was switching between characters, but one of the things I started to do in the final third of the story is I started to make the chapters shorter, and I would cut between them quicker. And they would go from 15 pages down to 10 pages, down to 8 pages, down to 6 pages or whatever, so that right at the end they would jump in between each other within the space of a few paragraphs. And it became breathless. You could feel yourself getting stressed, and it becomes quite cinematic. It's like a camera cutting from one character to the next to the next. That was something that was built into the shape of the story from the outset. And that also allowed me to sort of look at it and say, well, this moment is going to be quieter and more thoughtful. So I want to juxtapose it with another scene in which things are going to be faster and more action-driven. And then a scene after that. And sometimes, and this might be cutting between character points of view within different chapters, so that you feel like you're on a kind of roller coaster and you don't get stuck in a single mode all the way through. Now, some books will do that. Some books will find their groove and stay there throughout. And that's fine. But that's a different kind of story. And I think sometimes what I'm looking for is more balance between the different tonal modes that I'm in narrative terms. Because you are, in a sense, switching genres as you go. If you're writing a thriller, but there's a romance strand in it, tonally, those two areas are going to be very different. They're going to be woven together, but there are going to be moments where there's no romance at all, and you're running from people shooting at you and there are explosions and whatever, I don't know, falling off cliffs. And in those moments, you're not going to be thinking about your girlfriend, right? Or very, very sparingly. And then there are going to be other moments where it's all about that relationship, and it's going to be quieter and calmer, or more intense in a totally different kind of way. And it's going to affect your sentence structure. It's going to affect the way that you feel the emotion of the reader, because that's what you're doing all the time, right? You're trying to take the reader on a journey, and you're trying to anticipate that emotional move that the reader is on as they go from page to page and chapter to chapter. And so, again, all of this is helped, I think, by having some sort of structural model from the get-go, which allows you to anticipate those things and figure out exactly what the book needs at any given moment. And again, it's so much easier to make radical changes to plot and story and pacing and character notes and all that kind of stuff when you haven't already committed hundreds of pages to it. It's so much easier to just sit down and say, okay, let's change that and it affects a couple of paragraphs in my little outline, and that's all. I'm trying to think what I haven't said about what the outline itself should contain. I do feel like it's useful if it reads like a narrative, like a short story almost, because then it's like the novel reduced, so that you can share it with people if you want to say, what do you think of this? If you're sharing it with your editor, or even with a friend or a writing group or whatever, where you can get input and they can say, obviously, we're not getting all the texture that comes from the micro level within the novel itself, but as a structural model for the novel, yes, this works, or no, it doesn't, or I don't understand this, or why would this happen? Or maybe there's a way to make this particular scene more interesting. And again, if you're thinking about these things at the 30,000 foot level, you can spend time doing that. This particular thing has to be discovered by this character in this scene. What's the most interesting way I can do that? Where should it take place? Is he in a church? Is he in the jungle? Is it, you're right? I mean, depending on what your story is, but you can think about this stuff and say, I can figure out the ways to make this the most efficient and the most powerful and the most interesting, the most compelling, while I'm just moving little game pieces around in my little outline, rather than committing to something and writing an entire scene which takes place in a room that becomes sort of featureless and characters just talking to each other and we forget where they are and what's going on, and we're clearly just exchanging information, and it's banter and it's exposition, and it's not very interesting. So, okay, I think that's it. That's all I'm going to say on this. You may have other questions or follow-up questions. I will be doing another video because I already have new questions to respond to, and I'll probably come back to some of this, the question of writer's block and so on, in that next video. But for now, I've been talking too long as usual, so I will stop. So, as ever, please like, comment, subscribe, check out my books, check out my Patreon page. Thank you to my patrons who make this channel possible. Thanks to anybody who picks up a t-shirt or mug or whatever from my little merchandise page. Please keep the questions coming and the observations, so that will shape what I do when I do more of these videos. And until next time, thanks. Talk to you soon. Bye.